And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather, next storm pulling northward here, bringing strong winds into the eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula. Rain heavy at times for the Alaska Peninsula, spreading into Bristol Bay, becoming mixed precipitation across Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, mainly snow and blowing snow into the Kuskokwim Valley, all the way up to the northwest coast. Dry over the central, eastern, and northern interior with storm force easterly winds for the eastern Arctic coast, and snow on the increase here over the southeast part of the state, North Gulf Coast areas, and the Panhandle. For tomorrow, front brings rain and some gusty winds across Kodiak Island, becoming showers in the afternoon. Winds diminishing now for the eastern Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula as this low slowly moves northward there to just west of Cape Neuenham. And the next system pushing some more wind and snow and rain into the western Aleutians there. Snow continues to increase over the northern Panhandle and the North Gulf Coast, and with this trough over the southeast interior up into the upper Tanana Valley and 40-mile country. And for Sunday, storm force easterlies continue for the eastern Arctic coast, but much lighter winds elsewhere around the state, especially the Alaska Peninsula and the eastern Aleutian areas. And rain and snow for the Panhandle. Next system bringing gusty winds and rain into the western Aleutians and southwest Bering Sea. Coastal water forecast for the south coast of the Panhandle. We've got east to south winds 15 to 20 knots, and the central coast south to southeast winds at 20 knots. And then east to southeast at 15 to 20 knots for the north coast. Passes Canal, east winds at 20 knots. With 4-foot seas, north winds at 15 knots for Lynn Canal and east winds at 15 knots for Clarence Strait. And for Sunday, winds all southeast here over the inside waters at about 15 knots for Clarence Strait and Stevens Passage. Southeast 20, gusts 35 for Lynn Canal. Southeast winds 20 to 30 knots in the south coast. East-southeast at 30 for the central coast and the north coast as well. Prince William Sound, east winds at 15 tomorrow. North Gulf Coast, east winds 25. Southeast 30 for the Barren Islands. Gale warnings, Kamishak Bay, where they'll be out of the east at 35 knots there. Cook Inlet, still looking at northeast winds 20 to 30 knots. And for Sunday, swing those winds around. Southwest for Cook Inlet, 15 to 20 knots with 3 to 5-foot seas. West winds at 20 for Kamishak Bay and about 15 knots out of the west for the Barren Islands. North Gulf Coast, southwest winds 20 knots, Prince William Sound. Small craft advisories in the forecast for Sunday there with south winds at 25 knots and seas up to 6 feet. Kodiak Island, small craft advisories tomorrow, east-southeast winds 25 to 30 knots. Otherwise, storm warnings for the Alaska Peninsula. Southwest winds 50 knots, southeast winds at 40 knots for Bristol Bay. And then for Sunday, Kodiak Island, west-northwest winds at 15 knots. Alaska Peninsula, westerlies 20 to 25 knots. West 25 for Bristol Bay. For the western Aleutians on Saturday, tomorrow, as the next front approaches, southwesterly gales will increase there from Kiska to Shemya, 35 to 40 knots. Otherwise, look for westerly winds up to 30 to 35 knots for the central Aleutian areas. And good storm warnings out for Unalaska Island. West and northwest winds at 55 knots. And for Sunday, eastern Aleutians, a lot lighter on the winds, southwest 20 to 30 knots. Gale warnings push into the Adak-Atka area south at 40 knots. And storm warnings here for the area from Kiska to about Adak, or Amchitka Island more specifically, for south to southwest winds 50 to 55 knots. And for the southwest coast, for Saturday, east winds 30 knots, St. Lawrence Island and the Yukon Delta coast. Gale warnings for Norton Sound east at 35, and gale warnings for the southwest coast here, Kuskokwim Delta coastline, for southeast winds at 40 knots. Storm warnings for the Pribilof Islands, northwest winds at 50 knots with 18-foot seas. And for Sunday, St. Paul and St. George, looking at southwest winds at 30 knots, west winds at 30 knots for the west coast or southwest coast here. St. Lawrence Island, southwest at 30 knots. Norton Sound, southeast winds 30 knots. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, storm warnings, east winds 50 knots. And east at 45 knots there for the central coast. Gale warnings for the western Arctic coast as well. East winds 35 knots. And for the Chukchi Sea, gale warnings for east winds 35 to 40 knots. Those come down a little bit on Sunday for the Chukchi Sea, east at about 30 knots. Western Arctic coast down under gales now, east winds at 30 knots. And 40-knot winds for the west central and central Arctic coast, east at 40, but 50-knot easterlies continue for the far eastern Beaufort Sea.